In 2017, a painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat sold at auction for 110 million US dollars. Basquiat died in 1988, but his works have spiraled up in value, and he has joined such celebrated contemporary artists as Keith Haring and KAWS in regularly attracting multi-million dollar prices for his art. He also shares another similarity with these artists in starting his career doing graffiti on city walls. Basquiat honed his painting skills on the streets of New York with a spray can in hand, leaving his mark around the city. Keith Haring too developed his cartoon-inspired style, drawing on subway stations. Yes, graffiti, that scourge of the inner city, the urban blight of vandalism and property destruction that confronts us daily, an ugly combination of spray paint, concrete, and the disaffection of the modern youth. But drawing on walls has an unbelievably long history. 44,000 years, would you believe? Starting with cave paintings and continuing through the ages. Ancient Greeks and Romans visiting Egypt left their names and stories marked on the pyramids, and Roman art treasures were in turn defaced by the Vikings, who made it to Italy and carved runes into statues. But graffiti was not just used as a calling card. All the ancient cultures used graffiti for political and social commentary. Public walls were an ideal medium for common people to anonymously share their thoughts to a wide audience. It was a social media platform of the time. And graffiti could equally be used as a way to share messages with a narrow audience. The hobos of 19th century America developed a type of code that could be scratched into wood or stone, leaving notes for others arriving in the area about what to expect, notes that could not be understood by the authorities. But graffiti as we know it, self-promoting tags and murals made in spray paint, arose in the East Coast cities of the USA in the mid-60s, and arose in response to the conditions of the time. New York became the most active center of graffiti, particularly in the 70s and 80s, as any photo of New York streets or subway trains from that period will show. And at that time, New York was a city in crisis. Graffiti was an expression of civil discontent. In many ways, it was a product of poverty and inequality, and an important way for marginalized communities to find a voice. And, very importantly, a way for them to mark the city as their own, in their own way. But it was also an expression of a new identity arising in America, a part of hip-hop culture that flourished across many forms of artistic expression. And as part of hip-hop culture, it was a form of rebellion against authority and conservative mainstream culture. In fact, graffiti was a front line in the class war of the time. The mayor of New York even joked about using wild wolves to guard train cars from graffiti artists. But at heart, graffiti is about getting your name and your work seen by as many people as possible. It was a competition like any other part of hip-hop, and that competition drove the artists to achieve greater notoriety by spreading their work as widely as possible, and by impressing with their artistic skill and inventiveness. Graffiti artists climbed walls and sneaked into train yards under the cover of night, often working in crews, and they developed a unique graphic style of strong lettering and bold compositions, called wild style, all in an effort to outdo and impress their rivals. Names such as Taki 183, Futura 2000, Zephyr, and Blade became legendary. It was in New York in the 80s that Basquiat started graffitiing using the tag SAMO, the same old shit. He often included cryptic anti-authoritarian slogans with his tags, also often adding a stylized crown or a copyright symbol, a knowing reference to the ambiguity of the ownership of an anonymous work in a public space. Over time, graffiti artists developed new techniques, such as stencils and stickers, that allowed their work to be produced in advance and put in place much faster. Graffiti could now be made in the studio and pasted up ever more brazenly in more public places. This led to the appearance of the so-called street artists, artists who used a prominent display of their graffiti and meme-like culture jamming messages to further their professional careers. These artists, the likes of KAWS and Shepard Fairey, abandoned anonymity, or in the case of Banksy, deliberately used their anonymity to generate notoriety. And the ground was changing in other ways. Graffiti began to gain mainstream acceptance. Spaces were made in cities specifically for graffiti artists to do their work, and graffiti styles were adopted in other graphic fields. It even came to be recognized, by some at least, as an art form in itself and was exhibited in galleries. Basquiat himself was discovered through his graffiti work. Once he moved to painting in the studio, he quickly became a huge success. His work evolved, but always retained remnants of his rough street painting style. His works also had an energy that spoke to his troubled upbringing. Graffiti is now a big business. Street artists promote themselves through their public work, and former graffitiists produce their artworks with big-pocketed buyers in mind. But what is graffiti when it is taken out of its original context? Hanging in galleries or private collections, it no longer speaks to passers-by. And produced with rich buyers in mind, it no longer uses the language of the marginalized urban underclass. While there are snooty debates about whether graffiti can be called art, there is also the question about whether it remains graffiti once it is considered art. This was, after all, a movement, an art movement if you like, created by kids and largely for kids. If it communicated with the powerful, the rich, the elite, it was with contempt. Basquiat, by the way, died of a heroin overdose. He was driven to drugs by his own personal demons, but also by being ground down by the art industry. He craved recognition as an artist, but instead he became an art celebrity, a piece of work himself. I can't but wonder what Samo, with his anti-consumerist messages, would think of the millions paid for his untitled work. Despite its mainstreaming and commodification, graffiti to this day continues as a form of popular expression, and even stronger, as a form of protest. It gives a voice to the oppressed, and it can shame the powerful, and it will be with us while there are still walls to write on.